podcast, or the CUPP, where we'll be spilling all sorts of tea about what's going on in Washington, D.C., what lawmakers and regulators are thinking and working on, and what you at your credit union should be thinking about as potential risk areas and areas of opportunity. My name is Ann Petros. I'm NAFCU's Vice President of Regulatory Affairs. And yes, I did recently change my name because I got married. And today I am joined by a very special guest, NCUA's Chairman Todd Harper. And we will be talking about DEIB and why it is so critical to your institution and, just to the credit union community and to moving our world forward. So thank you so much for being here today. I'm honored that you're taking the time to join me on this podcast.
I'm so pleased that we can join and we can do it in person. It really makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. After years of Zoom meetings, it's really nice to sit down on a couch a few feet away from each other and have some candid conversations. Yeah.
Yep.
So let's
Well, I'm looking
in.
forward to it.
Yeah.
Fire away, Ann.
All right, awesome. So we all know or should know what DEI stands for, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But, what does it really mean and why is DEI, so important for credit unions?
So, Ann, I like to distill it down to two things. Mm-hmm. Happy employees, happy members. And that's really what you need to keep in mind. And when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and how they can make both your employees happy as well as your members happy. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are foundational principles on which really the credit union system is built. It's about reaching out, making sure that you're hitting all target audiences, and not only just hitting the target audiences, but also recognizing where they are and what their needs may be. Mm-hmm. For your employees, it creates greater connectedness to the organization. It allows them to bring their full selves into the workplace. It also allows them to contribute more. Some of your employees may have an idea about a product, a service that they will know from their community that is needed that you may not think necessarily is brought up as needed. And by having your employees more connected to you, what you're ultimately going to get is better member service, and you're going to be developing those products that they need. So diversity, equity, inclusion is sort of an underpinning in everything that credit unions can and should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Something you just said kind of sparked a thought. Do you think that, like micro lending and small business lending is a perfect example?
I think that's absolutely a perfect example. And I like to think about a trip that I took before the pandemic began, and I was meeting with a credit union in Ohio. And I was sitting down with the loan officer, and I asked her, so what was the most interesting or most fulfilling loan that you ever made? And the loan officer talked about how a member came in, her sister was dying, and she needed money to get that plane fare to see her sister one last time. Mm-hmm. And the woman had a really terrible credit score, and she really didn't have any assets except for this used car which she was driving. And the credit union was able to work with her in this time of need to actually come up with the money that was needed as a loan, with the car backing it. It is those small dollar loans that make a difference in people's lives, and they create the stories. And I always encourage credit unions to talk about the stories as to how they're changing people's lives, and that is exactly the type of micro lending, small dollar lending that's needed to be done. And this actually allowed two sisters to have their last moments together, and that's a really special and important time that credit unions can help facilitate.
Yeah, that's a really sweet story. And, if a consumer can't turn to their credit union to get that sort of loan in a moment of need, where else are they going to turn?
Exactly. Yeah. Payday lenders, right, which are not economically feasible for many people.
Sure. No. Now, I've heard you mention belonging, and I said DEIB. So what is the significance of belonging, and what does it mean to you, and why is that something that credit unions should think about?
Great question. And it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And belonging is that secret sauce. It's when you get the diversity, equity, and inclusion right, you can actually get that belonging. What does that belonging mean? Well, for your employees, it means they've got a greater commitment to the organization. They're less likely to leave the credit union. You're going to see lower turnover costs. They're going to be more productive, because we know that people who belong and feel that they have a sense of pride in their organization are going to do a better job. And so that belonging is just such an important part of creating the deeper commitment that allows the credit union to do its job better.
Yeah. Do you think that, I'm asking you to speculate here.
Sure.
If more organizations fostered a sense of belonging, that we wouldn't have seen quite as big of a resignation in this great resignation?
Yeah. I think that that's certainly one of many factors that are out there. I had a professor in college who always said to me, that's a bivariate answer in a multivariate world. And, I think that certainly you're right. If that you had been fostering the diversity, equity, and inclusion during the pandemic, you would see that deeper commitment that would help to cut back on the turnover. I know that we kept up our DEI programming throughout the pandemic because we felt it was important to do. And frankly, it was one of the few ways that we could still bring people together to network, and they really enjoyed those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's important to have, and it can feel sort of forced in this virtual environment,
Agreed.
but some sort of networking opportunity where people can get together and just feel normal, feel like they're making those informal connections in an otherwise very structured environment.
Yep.
So, we're coming off the heels of June, which is Pride Month for the LGBTQIA plus community.
Yep.
And, you were invited to deliver remarks at the CU Pride Leadership Conference.
I was.
So could you, tell us a little bit about what your message was at that conference, and, what is the significance of CU Pride?
No, first of all, CU Pride, for those who may not know, is a new industry networking group. It's an ERG, employee resource group, across the credit union system that brings to people of LGBTQ persuasion, but also their allies, to the table to support one another, to create those opportunities. It's grown rapidly. My understanding is they're almost at 1,400 members. This is only in their second year nationwide. I mean, think about it. And so I did speak to them. It was a great honor to sit down and talk to them. And I think the first thing that's most important, I talked about them that representation matters. Mm-hmm. Having the right people at the table, having an LGBTQ voice at the table really does affect your decision making. I can think back to when I started working for Debbie Matz at the agency when she was chair, and a friend of mine came to me and said, "Did you see that your equal employment opportunity statement does not cover sexual orientation?" And I said, I hadn't noticed it. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Debbie, and the next time we issued that statement, it was covered. And if you don't have somebody at the table to make those, help seeing those decisions, right. You don't necessarily see, or you have the blind spots, and this is a great way to close your blind spots overall. So I talked about representation matters. I also talked about my own coming out experience. When I first joined the government back in 1990, you could still be fired for being gay.
It's a different time.
It's a very different time. You could lose your security, or you might not get a security clearance because you were gay. And, in the time that we've seen since, we've seen that change in society, the acceptance in society, and that's really important. And that's been the result of tens of thousands, of hundred thousands, of millions of people coming out. So people know who is gay, who is a lesbian, and if you know somebody, you're much less likely to discriminate, and you're also much more likely to include. And that's such an important thing. I also talked about how I had become a more inclusive leader, and as a result, growing up in the 1980s, it was still a very homophobic world, and you had to learn cues and understand social cues. Mm-hmm. And I at least like to think, actually, I know it's not just that I think, I became more inclusive because I had to read people. I had to see who I could talk to and who I couldn't. I mean, and going back to the 1980s, I'm going to tell you how far we were in the closet. I and my two other roommates were roommates together for a couple of years. None of us knew we were gay until 10 years after college. That is the type of world we lived in at the time. But I talked about how it's become a more inclusive leader. And then lastly, and I'm kind of proud of this, this year the NCUA flew the pride flag for the very first time at the agency. It was an important symbol to people to show that we are an inclusive agency, and we had a uniformly very positive response to flying the flag. And I have to admit, if you come into the NCUA offices coming down King Street, you know that our offices are a gateway into Old Town Alexandria. And to see that flag flying at the gateway is just really we've come a long way, and it is great to see.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And I mean, that story about you and your roommates in college is just amazing.
Yep.
And, you know, as a white, heterosexual, cis woman, I have a lot of privilege, you know, and I'm aware of that.
Understood.
But, you know, I'm also an ally, and I try, you know, every day to put myself in somebody else's shoes, to walk a mile in their shoes, and to better, you know, understand the challenges that they might be facing. But it can be difficult to do that and to know the right way to do it, you know, and I guess what's your advice to anyone watching or listening about, you know, how to be a good leader with inclusivity in mind, and you know, how to adopt an inclusive and collaborative perspective?
First, believe it. If you don't believe it, if you're not, you know, emoting it, if you're not talking about it, people will see it as fake. And so you really, truly have to believe it. And I know you're a little younger than I am. I was the first generation raised on Sesame Street. And what do we know about Sesame Street? It really was creating inclusion. And so I breathe this. It's part of who I am. It's part of what I'm about. And if you are a leader who embraces it, talk about it. And don't be afraid to talk about it. You know, I will say this, you know, I was in the closet for many, many years. I didn't come out to my parents until I was 29 years old, even though I had been in a relationship by that time for 5 years. Sure. Overall, being able to talk about it and not being afraid to talk about it, and I'm not talking about being militant. I'm talking about in natural courses of conversation coming up. It's important to do that, and it's important to bring other people on board, because one of my first mentors in government is a woman by the name of Pat Neal. Pat's not what you would expect for a mentor. You know, I'm a white Midwestern kid who went to college, you know, and got a degree. Pat grew up here on the East Coast, an African American, and she did not have the luxury of going to college. In fact, it wasn't expected at the time. But she started off her career as a GS2 secretary in the federal government and rose to the very highest portion of the career ladder because of learning opportunities and bringing people into the table. And I mentioned Pat because she used to have a poster that I now have in her office that says, when differences and understanding begins. And you have to have those conversations so that you can start ending those differences, or at least building a common set of knowledge around, a common organizational knowledge around what those standards are, so that really the understanding can begin and the organization can grow.
It's wonderful. Yeah, that's a beautiful message, and, you know, a good way to think about kind of bridging the gap.
Yeah.
So, you know, how are the concepts of DEI embedded within the credit union industry and mission? And do you think that this gives credit unions an advantage over, let's say, other financial institutions, big banks?
So I like to take it a step back, and it just makes good business sense to practice diversity, equity, inclusion. The research is clear, and it is shown time and time again, for those organizations that embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, they actually have higher earnings, and they perform better, and they do better well overall. So I don't think that any one financial institution over another necessarily has an advantage when it comes to DEI, because I've seen it happening in both credit unions as well as other types of financial institutions.
Sure.
That said, if you think about credit unions and the cooperative nature, and you think about what the mission is, and that mission is to meet the credit and savings needs of members, especially those of modest means.
Right.
We know that people of modest means are more likely to be people of color, more likely to be LGBTQ, more likely to be any number of underserved communities. And by reaching out to them and bringing them in, you can really do a better job. I know that in the credit union system, there's been a discussion about the cooperative model and its 7 pillars, and adding an additional pillar that would create diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of it. It's a smart idea, and I certainly hope that the industry is able to bring people around to it, because I think it will make change, and it is really what co-ops are all about: bringing people together, creating that common equity, and allowing people to grow and achieve better lives.
Yeah. Seems like it's important to solidify that as part of the mission.
Indeed.
Goals. So what's the single biggest DEI success or achievement for the NCUA, in the credit union industry as a whole? So how has the agency kind of been involved in this DEI effort and been successful?
Wonderful question. If you go back, we really began our DEI efforts in earnest 11 years ago at the start of 2011. And that was because the Dodd-Frank Act said we had to create an Office of Minority and Women Inclusion. And I've gotten to see the evolution of that office and what it brings to the agency. And I am always amazed at the good work that they do, because it's a very small office, and it's a lean, and it's a flexible, and it's a nimble office. But right now, for example, as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion journey, we developed a supplier diversity program. And that supplier diversity program says, in any contract that we let, we're going to make sure we reach out to minority and women-owned businesses. And just that simple change, inviting them to the table to compete. Some years we've had more than 40% of our contract dollars have gone to minority and women-owned businesses.
That's really huge.
It's a huge thing. And in fact, if you look at all other financial services regulators, we're at the top, either at the very top or in the top couple each year for how many of our dollars are going out to minority and women-owned businesses. So that's a real key change. Another key change that I absolutely love seeing at the agency is we now have 7 employee resource groups that are bringing people together. SWAN is our women's employee supporting women at the NCUA is what SWAN stands for.
It's a great acronym.
Isn't it a great acronym? And they're doing things like networking to how do you do better on interviews, or how do you prepare and find mentors in your career. So they're doing some specialty programs there. In fact, one of the biggest things our Amway office does is the mentoring program each year. We had about 50 mentoring pairs in our most recent class of individuals, and I've heard firsthand from them about how the mentoring experience actually helped people to get that next job within the agency, that they had been trying for that higher level job, but they hadn't gotten it, but the mentor was able to help make that difference. I think we're making some real difference in people's lives. And then lastly, last year, 2 out of every 5, so 40% of our new hires were people of color. It has been the small steps that have created big change within the organization.
Those are all things to be really proud of.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. And I know the agency for the past couple of years has been putting on a DEI summit.
Yes,
so
we have.
when is the next DEI summit?
So the next DEI summit is going to be November. Oh, I've just gone blank on it. It's 2nd and 3rd, but we're going to actually start it on the 1st. We're going to do a pre-track, pre-event set of workshops. The 2nd and 3rd are going to be the primary days. It's going to be up in Baltimore. Stay tuned for details.
Okay.
And we're going to have a hybrid DEI summit this year that's going to be both in person and virtual for people who may not be ready to travel or may just have a schedule that doesn't provide the flexibility to travel. Last year, we had 800 participants across the system participate. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing higher and better numbers this year. And I think also, too, one of the more important things that we're doing is we're going to have a track for minority depository institutions.
Wonderful.
And so they will have some sort of specialized workshops and breakout sessions and be part of the conference, because we recognize that there are a lot of symmetries between and similarities between advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion and advancing what is needed for MDI institutions. Little known fact, 1 out of every 10 credit unions is an MDI. That means that a majority of their members are people of color, and a majority of their leadership is people of color.
Yeah.
It's a really great statistic to know.
It is. It is. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. And, I remember attending the first DEI summit, and it was just one day.
Yep.
And the biggest, the most impactful feedback was, hey, we need more time. Let's spread this out over 2 days. There's just too much to cover. There's, a lot that we want to talk about as participants, as attendees at this event. And so it's just really fantastic to see that interest and the desire to talk about these issues.
So much so, absolutely.
Yeah. And, what else remains to be done for the agency, though? Is there more to do?
There's always more to do when you're an agency, and quite frankly, one of the most important things we need to be doing now is preparing for any economic displacements that may be occurring as a result of the rising interest rate environment. We also need to be preparing the agency for what comes next with respect to going on site more often. We are continuing to work to increase our number of specialties. As the industry has concentrated, we've also seen the need for greater specialization. We a few years ago, we created the regional information specialists so that you can do with the IT exams and looking at it. We are looking at what more can we do with regional lending specialists. We're looking at what we should be doing with respect to payment systems. That's actually electronic payment systems is one of our new specialties that we're working on. So we need to continue to evolve as the industry evolves overall.
Yeah, there's so much changing in the payment space, so that is
absolutely.
not surprising.
Absolutely.
My next question is something that I think some of our listeners or viewers may be asking themselves, and so what does the NCUA budget do to help the DEI efforts or initiatives at the agency? Some may argue that it's inappropriate for the NCUA to be spending money on these sorts of efforts. That these are credit union dollars, and this is not what that money is intended for. So, what would you say to them?
So, I would give you 3 very concrete and simple reasons. First and foremost, we have a statutory responsibility. We have to have an Office of Minority and Women and Inclusion, and we need to make sure that that office has resources to do what it needs to do. We are helping to spur a discussion within the credit union system overall and within the movement about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we have a statutory responsibility. And I will also say this, as I said earlier, our office is a lean office. It works with about 10 people, and we are able to accomplish quite a bit. So it is a small dollar investment has brought out a big dollar return. If you think back 11 years ago, we were not having these discussions within the broader credit union system, and now they're happening everywhere. So that is reason number 1. Reason number 2, the business imperative. We need to help credit unions understand the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why it can make sense for the bottom line, and how embracing that diversity, equity, inclusion in their leadership teams, on their boards. Quite frankly, sometimes having just one person on the board can make a huge, huge difference. I remember I served on a board once, and we had a young Latina. She was in her early 20s, and she came to the board meeting and she raised this one issue, and it led to this incredibly in-depth discussion that by the time we were done with that meeting, we had an action plan. Think about what it is if you had a few people at the age of 20 or 25 on your board, part of the prime borrowing years, who understand how products get delivered and how people use them and what are the products that are needed. It can make a real difference in how you do business, the types of lending that you do, and what you do. So having diverse membership, having diverse boards, having diverse leadership can help you to identify those opportunities. And then last thing I would say to those who are skeptical, this is really about fulfilling the credit union mission. As I said earlier, we've got this mission of meeting the credit and savings needs of members, especially those of modest means. And who are people of modest means? It's often those people who have not had a seat at the table throughout our history. And this helps to bring them into the financial mainstream. And that can only be good for the credit union movement overall.
Yeah, you mentioned those reports. Do you think that just not enough people know about them and the real benefits that DEI can bring to your institution, your bottom line? And I guess a second, not really question, but follow up is that credit unions should be focused on the next generation. It's no longer just millennials. You're looking at Gen Z now, and that is majority minority and very open-minded generation. Really, interested in inclusion and interested in working with organizations that embody their beliefs.
Yeah, no, I think you raised a really excellent point, Anne. And if you look at the generational change, this is going to allow the credit union system to get ahead of it. I don't think anybody is deliberately ignoring it necessarily in the credit union system. I think, though, that many credit unions are small. And as you know, 2/3 almost of credit unions have less than $100 million in assets. Right. I think they're spending their days often meeting their current needs of their membership. This is about strategic planning and thinking ahead. And, I have seen that those organizations that have strategic plans, they're going to perform better. And we need to help make credit unions aware of what the strategy needs to be so that they can be thinking about it and developing those plans accordingly.
Yeah. And, a lot of those smaller institutions are really doing so much good work in their communities. So how does DEI come into the fold in that respect and in the work that credit unions are doing to support their communities?
Knowing where their members are or how they want to get their financial services is very much a key factor overall. I'm actually going to do a slight twist on your question and my answer, and that is I recently became aware of a credit union that largely operates in rural America. And there was a town of about 500 people that did not have a financial institution. And they signed a petition and said, please open up an ATM at the general store in town. And 400 plus people in this town of 500 people signed that petition.
Wow.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Think about that. And they opened up, actually, they first did an ATM, and within a short amount of time, they figured out that an interactive teller machine was the better way. So they literally almost opened up a branch in the town in many ways that is allowing that town to get access to financial services. Think about what we could do and what the credit union system would do if it were, looking and listening to the community about where to open up and what products to provide and how much the system could grow and continue to grow. The system continues to grow in leaps and bounds. Don't get me wrong. And in fact, we're now about 15% of consumer deposits are at credit unions. That's a fantastic number.
Yeah.
Credit unions are going to keep growing if they're looking for these new audiences, these new places to find business, and that's important.
Yeah. I think innovation means not just adopting new, technologies and looking for new technologies, but thinking creatively about ways to engage your, potential members and your communities.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So it goes without saying, really, that the last couple of years have been tough for everyone. Yeah. The pandemic, the economic fallout that we're still dealing with, and inflation is just kind of the latest iteration of that.
Yep.
And, what have been the effects on credit unions, and, what are the challenges and opportunities moving forward?
So, first of all, the pandemic accelerated trends that have already been happening for a very long time.
Certainly.
The movement to technology, the movement to the mobile phone apps, the movement to online banking, we saw that just really grow dramatically. I actually had an opportunity early on in the pandemic to talk to a credit union that actually, the week before the pandemic began, turned on its website. Think about that. It's just
gosh.
about the fantastic timing of that. And then I talked to another credit union that actually turned on its mobile app a week after the pandemic. The credit unions, regardless of type, have all had to change and respond to these changes in technologies to meet their members, if you will, where they are.
Right.
Also, too, I think the pandemic has really laid bare many of the economic disparities that were already existing. They've helped opened our eyes to where some of those disparities are. And that is both a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for credit unions to reach out, to grow. I was recently talking with a woman who's in the process of helping to charter a new credit union, and it's in an African-American neighborhood that has been very much underserved in a city where the white-owned population has home ownership rates north of 70%, and the black-owned home ownership rate is 20%. And if you think about it, how do you build wealth in this country? There are three ways.
That's how you do it.
One is you start your own business.
Right.
So small business, run it, grow it, believe in it, and treat it. Second, you open and continue to fund a retirement account. That's a way to build wealth. And the third, and this is probably the most important way, is home ownership. And that credit union, when it gets chartered and when it gets to the next phase, is going to be very much focused on making those home loans, to changing for the community what's happening. Also, too, I had a conversation earlier this year with a large group of small credit unions. So a lot of small credit unions rather than a large group of small credit unions. And in talking to them, one of the things I heard loud and clear, labor markets have changed. And it's been hard for them to keep and retain and find new employees to bring them on board. And several of them have had to recalibrate their pay structures in order to make sure that they could continue to be competitive. Those are some of the things that we've seen that credit unions have had to face. Certainly a rising interest rate environment comes to mind, where credit unions are going to need to stay focused on that. But also, too, we've seen strains on the net worth ratio of credit unions throughout this pandemic. We were able to adopt some temporary rules that allowed credit unions some greater opportunity to move during the course of the pandemic, given that all of these share deposits that came in, more than any of us could have ever expected at the start of the pandemic because of the fiscal response that Congress did. But, at a certain point in time, we have to start to look at those deposits and say, Are they sticky? Are they temporary? Or are they sticky? And I think we're getting close to the point where we're recognizing that many of these deposits are sticky and that they're going to stay in the system. The system overall, though, has maintained strong.
Yep.
The other thing, too, that I just want to point out from the agency's perspective, we've really had to change the way in which we do exams. There will always be a place for in-person, particularly the relationship building between the management of a credit union and our examiners.
So important.
You need to have that face-to-face, in-person contact. But we've realized that we can do much more of the exam off-site. And so going forward, we're not going to return to the on-site exam as we knew it, but there will be a new form where we are on-site for certain parts, maybe sometimes reviewing loan files at small credit unions. It's harder for smaller credit unions to pull those documents together. It's easier for us to go there and
A
look
lot
at
may not
it.
be digitized.
Absolutely, and you've hit the right on the nose, as we like to say at times. So we're going to be adjusting to and recalibrating how we go about doing that. And a large part of that is the new merit examination system, which is allowing for new analytics. It's how we do the exam. It's how information from the credit union is getting put into the system so that we can do those virtual exams. And if I could, one last thing, surprising statistic. You would think that by less travel, we would be more productive in our exams. What we've actually found is that it about nets out, because what we used to spend in travel time, we're now spending time communicating with the credit unions to get the loan files delivered, to get the policy delivered, to get the whatever. So it's kind of washed out from one another. Sure. We didn't necessarily see the savings that we thought we would.
Yeah. You think there's maybe a little bit of duplication or just extra effort, kind of technology challenges, things like that come into play?
Yep.
Yeah. It does seem that merit has been pretty successful so far.
So far, yeah. No, I know a lot of credit unions are, probably gearing up for their first exam in merit. One of the things I'm most excited about in merit is the new analytics. Our examiners will see dashboards. Credit unions are going to see new charts and templates that develop that are going to help them think more strategically about what they do. And if I could take a moment to have a humble brag, as we were going through the pilot phase, I was talking with a state supervisor who oversees both credit unions and banks, and they were part of the pilot for merit. And he said to me, actually, my bank examiners are looking over the shoulder and seeing that we're state of the art and we've got a better system than what is on the bank side. And
that's great.
I think that's a real accomplishment for us all.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've heard, the E&I staff or you and the other board members say as much in recent board meetings, but, when you hear the story from state examiners themselves, like that's really impactful.
Yeah, it really does.
All right. Well, that does it for my questions, but do you have any final thoughts?
So a couple of things. First of all, please stay focused on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. If I have to put a plug in here, don't forget the credit union diversity self-assessment. It is a fantastic tool that helps credit unions to think about diversity, equity, inclusion. Before the pandemic, we traveled before the pandemic, and I was visiting a credit union in Texas, and I asked whether they knew about the self-assessment, and they said no. I sent it to them. A week later, one of the executives at that credit union said to me, he said, just looking at the questions has changed the way I think about it, and it's helped me to frame ideas.
Right.
So, whether you do the diversity self-assessment or not, I hope that you do, and if you do, please send in your results voluntarily to us, because it helps us to collect bigger data to understand what's happening in this space. But just looking at it can be a great starting point for beginning your DEI journey.
But it is voluntary, right?
It is voluntary. It is 100% voluntary.
No impact
on exams whatsoever. We keep them in different places, and we don't,
That's good to know.
We do not we have a Chinese wall between, and we're looking for what further we can do to build confidence in that Chinese wall, so to speak. Second of all, stay focused on your members right now. We're in a very challenging time with interest rates, and we're starting to see people at the lower end of the credit spectrum are starting to see their scores drop. And Members are going to need help. And if you stay focused on your members, they're going to remember who supported them in their times of needs. And that loyalty is going to result in better returns for the credit union in the long term. Third, also, stay focused on capital, stay focused on your liquidity, and stay focused on credit quality. Those are three imperatives at this point in time. Sort of the last thing, Anne, that's been on my mind, the current geopolitical events around the world have really increased cybersecurity threats. And we have seen bad actors probing systems in the credit union space. We need to make sure that everybody pays attention to cybersecurity right now, in particular, because we need, I worry, and what I worry most about at night, quite frankly, isn't whether the credit union system can get through a rising interest rate environment. It's what happens if bad actors use the credit union system as a gateway to cause harm within the broader financial services system. We really do need to everybody to pay attention to what they're doing to practice good cyber hygiene, to make sure that their systems are strong, and make sure that they are also protecting their members.
Yeah. All excellent reminders and points to highlight. And, on cybersecurity, it's almost every day that I see some sort of like phishing email. I mean, we have a fantastic, IT and security system here at NAFCU, but, sometimes things just come through, and in my personal email, how does this happen?
And let's remember that most cybersecurity, problems, the number one is human error.
Right.
That you see that email and you click on that button, you click here, and
it's that simple.
Or you click on that attachment, and all of a sudden, it's important that we all be aware, regardless.
It can happen in a flash.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been an incredible pleasure. And we've talked about some really, really important topics and issues, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is so important in our communities, in the credit union industry, and just how we go about our day-to-day lives. So,
I so agree.
Thank you.
I so agree.
Again.
My pleasure, and always.
All right. Well, that does it for this episode of the CUPP, and we'll see you again soon.